and its values. And so Canada has a vital and existential stake in the vitality and viability of NATO. But I also bring, I think, a personal sort of perspective on this that's perhaps a little different, in the sense that I was born in Germany and grew up some of my life in Munich. At the time, not a mere 80 kilometers or so from the then Iron Curtain. And so that, brings us back to the first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, his famous quote that NATO is about keeping the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And in many ways, look, I mean, the organization, 75 years, through all the challenges, both political and resource, has proven itself surprisingly sustainable and resilient. And I think that in itself is an interesting topic for discussion and conversation. And I think surprisingly, in terms of how different the countries are, when push comes to shove, how everybody is able to find common ground, both at the Atlantic Council in terms of the decision-making process and the decisions made, and then at the military committee in terms of implementing those decisions. And I think over NATO's history, I think this is quite a remarkable achievement in terms of an international institution, and inherently all multilateral institutions have their internal challenges. But I think this has proven particularly important. And look, I think when I say like it's succeeded, and I think succeeded beyond expectations so far, it has done so in terms of containing and continuing to contain the challenges that the former Soviet Union and now Russia poses to European unity, harmony, territorial integrity, prosperity. It's also succeeded in some ways of keeping the Germans down. I mean, we spent the first 50 years of the 20th century pushing the Germans back into their boundaries. We spent the next 50 years telling them to stay there. And now we're surprised when the Germans are a little bit reticent to go other places in the world. And so far, the organization has also succeeded in keeping the Americans in. And everybody knew from the outset, as this quote suggests, that this was always going to be one of the fundamental challenges within the organization. So in some ways, what we're living today is continuity, but I think, as we'll have an opportunity to talk about during the discussion, there are also suggestions of increasing divergence. And I think that poses an interesting challenge for Canada and for the alliance in terms of where it is headed as an organization and as its broader role in the region and in the world. So I'll leave it there, but that's sort of broadly sort of what, I think we can close on. Having sort of grown up in Europe, I think we don't always have an appreciation in North America for the fragility of democracy and the challenges that democracy faces every day. And I think given the rise of authoritarian systems, and especially digital authoritarianism, and attempts to undermine the integrity and legitimacy of our own democratic institutions by our adversaries and both state and non-state actors, democracy needs to be defended, and it needs to be defended every day. And I think it would be a grave mistake to take democracy for granted. And NATO plays a vital role in the resilience and flourishing of the values and the democratic way of life that we cherish.
100%. What a great defense. I wouldn't think that Dr. Alexander Mons has much to criticize or to disagree with there, but Dr. Mons, you do have the opportunity every year to see NATO anew through the eyes of your students, going to NATO headquarters, going to the NATO Defense College. Perhaps if you could maybe color your comments from that point of view, I think that it's such a valuable experience that you have.
Very happy to do so, always. But let me back up a little and add some personal perspective also, which helps understand why the NATO Field School and Simulation Program is important to me. So I want to mention two events. One of them is in 1992, I had the great opportunity. I was the first Marcel Cadieux Fellow in the Policy Planning Bureau in then called DFAID, External Affairs, our foreign ministry, currently called GAC in Ottawa. And my 4-month stay there allowed me access to all the diplomatic correspondence between Canada and our mission in Brussels called NATO, NATO, and our mission with the European Union, which was just then changed from European Economic Community to the European Union after the Maastricht Agreement in 1991. I was there in the first half of 1992. And I found it fascinating to see the debate among Canadian diplomats. Because if you remember, Article 2 of the Washington Treaty, of the founding treaty of NATO, often referred to as the Canadian article, was very much about Canada hoping that out of this military alliance could grow a transatlantic community that would include economic, commerce, and other institutional aspects. And that Article 2 never really came off the ground much. Most of the other allies didn't have enough appetite for that. So NATO developed very much as a defense alliance. And in 1992, when the European Union received a common foreign and security policy, there were some Canadians that were hoping that we could bring to life again the whole concept of closer relations with Europe through the European Union. Found that fascinating. And I've always thought about that relationship for Canada between the European Union and NATO. But deep down, of course, my roots with NATO are even much deeper, because my mother's farm was literally liberated by a team of Canadian soldiers with some Brits and Poles among them in 1945, in the last months of the war. And our family's understanding of Canada's direct involvement in the liberation of Europe and the importance of keeping the United States and Canada as partners, as allies in Europe, is kind of part of my DNA, I guess. My interest in bringing my students along came essentially from probably the very same experience as all of us here have, which is we talk to our students about our experiences interviewing, watching exercises, talking with soldiers and officers. And I thought, why not bring them along? And found that in the NATO Defense College in Rome, there's excellent simulation programs which officers go through, which you can adjust a little, and then students go through. And I literally saw this alliance come alive in the eyes of my students, because if you're in Vancouver, it's very hard to imagine that NATO is the most important security and defense relationship we have, beside NORAD, of course, which my colleague Christian has very well explained. So the students realize our commitment, Canadian commitment, our ability, our reputation, our influence, why it matters in so many different ways that they couldn't imagine and couldn't feel out of the textbooks. My last point, however, is that NATO has always been relevant. And maybe this is closer to where Sarah is working. NATO has always been relevant because it essentially reflected the configuration of power in the international system. So think of its first stage, the Cold War. NATO is relevant because it's part of that one pole of the bipolar order. That ends in 1991, and NATO switches to crisis management instrument. Now it becomes a very helpful instrument of the unipolar order. But what I'm interested in today and in my research also is now we are looking at an emerging new configuration of power in the world. And that is, of course, with the rapid rise of China. So my argument is for NATO to be relevant, it must again reflect the configuration of power in the international system. And this is going to be enormously difficult because the Pacific is not another Atlantic. The Pacific is a very large piece of water, and there's very few countries that can actually play a role in the Pacific or in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a huge challenge. Canada has many interests at stake. We barely started to think about it. And I think it is going to lead to much bigger changes than we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years since the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dr. Moens. So we've got a series of 8 prepared questions that we can kind of dance around. I will address the questions to all 4 panelists. If we'd like to develop a bit more of a conversation, I think that would be great. But for right now, I'll just put it to all 4 of you one after another. So Dr. Moens, you kind of prepared us for our first question, which is really just to help discuss how Canada's foreign policy within NATO has changed since 1992. And I like the use of within there. NATO, of course, is an alliance which maintains everybody's sovereignty, but your sovereignty is somewhat constrained by the dedication of an attack upon one is an attack upon all. Foreign policy within the NATO framework, how has that changed since 1992? The publication of Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, and of course the fall of the USSR. Dr. Moens already pointed out a number of the different changes that are now facing us. And Christian already wonderfully illuminated Lord Ismay's comment about what NATO is for. Those 3 things, keeping the Germans down and the Russians out and the Americans in. But of course, the NATO treaty itself never mentioned a particular enemy, which was one of its brilliant simplistic elements. And of course, then it's been used for many different kinds of enemy. And by enemy, I mean different concepts. Terrorism, of course, responding to 9/11 being something which is quite different from what it was envisioned, the treaty, to do. So Dr. Greco, would you mind just taking us through a little bit about how you think Canada's foreign policy within NATO has changed since 1992? So it's a long time to chat about.
Absolutely. I think I can tie in some of the previous introductions as well in terms of NATO being a key underpinning of democracy globally and the role of NATO as a collective defense versus a cooperative security organization. And I think that the changes that we've seen over time certainly reflect the global political system and the changes that have occurred in the global political system. And I think that Canada's role has shifted from being focused more so on collective defense versus offering itself up as a beacon of leadership in cooperative security. So talking about crisis management, prevention and resolution, also looking at cooperative security from the perspective of open door policies and the opportunity for enlargement and partnership programs, and sort of how that's shifted over time. Because if what we've seen is, as was previously mentioned about Article 2, the Canadian article, and how that was an aspiration Canada had to have NATO transform into something that was more than simply a defense alliance. And as we've seen over time, that has shifted in terms of the strategic concepts that we've seen over the course of NATO's development, particularly in the most recent one. There's been an emphasis placed on cooperative security such that it's nearly placed on an equal footing as collective defense. And it's been that adaptation that's been particularly useful for the alliance and particularly useful to spotlight Canada's role within the alliance.
Dr. Lenochka, would you like to comment at all? No? Ditto?
I agree with Sarah on this one, yes.
Dr. Leprecht, Dr. Mons, any?
Yeah. Oh, Christian, you go first.
Go ahead, and I'll pick up maybe.
Yeah, just a few comments to add. NATO has always been an alliance based on both power and principle. So there is a military power and there is a values, norms, principle. In fact, NATO's preamble, if you go back to the Washington Treaty, NATO's preamble is very short, very beautiful, and very clear. It enunciates principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Clearer in some ways than the United Nations. And while these principles have always been with NATO, they were actually in many ways lying dormant during the Cold War. But I saw in Canada's foreign policy since 1992, Canada very much wanted to reinvigorate the preamble. So for Canada, the values and principles of NATO became much more important after 1992. And for us, it became a way to combine the limited military resources we have, though they're very mobile, very agile, and very well esteemed, but it became possible for us to combine our military security effort with real purpose to bring security, stability, democracy to the Balkans. And then, of course, in ISAF, in Afghanistan, we were hopeful, as many of our allies were in the beginning, that we could make significant changes. Of course, Afghanistan is a rather difficult place to do that. But I would say without the values and principles that are deeply embedded in NATO, as well as the very democratic-like structures of NATO in the Atlantic, in the North Atlantic Council and in many of the committees, lots of discussion and debate, very orderly, very procedurally, very Canadian. We find ourselves in a vehicle that is much more than a military bulwark. And therefore, for Canada, that this has been an important adjustment. And it helped us also in the logic of NATO expanding or enlarging, is the word I prefer, into Eastern Europe.
So I think, so there's a nice opportunity here, I think, to make a segue and to pick up on this. So I think this is really at the heart of also what makes NATO so instrumental to Canada, but also what makes NATO so contentious. This combination of collective defense and values. Now, if you listen to some of the countries with whom we have fundamental disagreements, take both China and Russia, when you hear them talk about values, make no mistake, listen very carefully. They make the case that there is such a thing as Chinese values. Vladimir Putin has made it very clear that there are Russian values and that these values are fundamentally different from those that the West holds. He's also made it clear, he's even tied this to sort of an ethnocentric concept, that there's sort of an ethnic, a particular identity that is rooted in the Slavic sort of ethnic identity that justifies and explains and gives rise to those values. Now, I raise this because if you think about the elements where there is contention, where there is agreement, I think there's sort of three basic sets of values that we need to distinguish in the international sphere. So one is this economic values. And until relatively recently, I would say there was it was the area where you could, where it was the easiest to get broad agreement in terms of trade and in terms of rules of trade. Now we know that this has become more contentious, but I would say it is still the area where there's probably the greatest sort of baseline consensus that we can work with internationally and multilaterally. The next set of values are political values. And they're a fundamental, it's not just about a different set of values, is that as members of the NATO alliance, we believe that there are particular values that are inherently important in terms of political stability, in terms of prosperity, in terms of how people relate to one another. And so this is not just about a differing set of values. It is a clear understanding that certain values are in the interests, in our own interests, not just because they reflect our interests, but because we fundamentally believe that this is a better way to run the world and the way that provides a positive sum game, not just for the countries of the world, but for the citizens of the world. But of course, there are many regimes that fundamentally disagree with that, not just by regime type in terms of authoritarian regimes, but also some of the broader sort of adversaries. And the third set, so we have the economic set of values, the political set of values, and the third set, which is ultimately the most contentious set of values, are the human rights values and an understanding of the value of human life and the importance of human life. And this is, I think, where NATO got particularly contentious. If you think in particular of the NATO interventions with UN authorization, be used to advance particular types of not just economic or political values, but fundamental sort of human rights values. And this is why you see today a discourse and a fundamental disagreement in the world over what sovereignty means, where China and Russia advance in conception of sovereignty as it was laid out sort of at the Yalta conference. The conception of sovereignty that member countries of NATO and NATO to some extent advance is an understanding of sovereignty that is broader than simply that every country is entitled to do within their boundaries, their territory, whatever they think is the appropriate set of human values or Chinese values or Russian values or whatnot. That we believe that fundamentally there are simply ways that are simply not particularly good ways of leading countries to stability and to prosperity. And I think one of the contentious issues, as Professor Mons raised, going forward is going to be what sort of agreement or not there is among member states of the instrument that NATO should be in terms of advancing economic goals, political goals, and or human rights goals, and what ultimately the purpose of NATO is. Is it to uphold a particular view of the international capitalist order? Is it to uphold and to promote a particular type of regime and the underlying values? Or is it much more broadly to advance particular types of also human rights conceptions and of human life? And the further you go on that spectrum, the more contentious NATO as an instrument gets, and the more contentious also the discussion within NATO gets about what role we should play. And I think we've learned some hard lessons there, especially when it comes to Kosovo and to Libya. In terms of that there are real limits to perhaps what the utility of NATO is, but we can leave that for a later point of discussion.
I think it's fair to say that Canadian foreign policy has become more and more enmeshed in a support for NATO. Chrystia Freeland's speech in 2017 laying out the foreign policy vision that Canada would be a supporter for the rules-based international order, and NATO being a very big part of that. I'm just curious to know what the four of you think as far as what were some of the steps that have led up to Canada doubling down on NATO, continuing to push, perhaps not reaching the 2%, of course, but trying to make sure that NATO is really at one of the top levels of foreign policy. What are some of the events? We've already mentioned, of course, a lot of the signature events, Libya and the Balkans, but what other particular events do you think have led up to this point where Canada is really trying to be seen as a champion of NATO? Open to everyone.
I'm happy to give a little bit of a start on this very rich question, Robert. It's a rich question. I think as a instrument of both power and principle, NATO's story is always a complex story. So one aspect that we need to add to this discussion is Canada and the United States and our particular relationship with the United States, and the fact that the United States is the first among equals in NATO, and a big first among equals. And so our commitment to NATO after 1992, as I mentioned earlier, is very much about values and principles. And I agree that what Christian mentioned, that the Chinese and the Russians do have, and particularly the Chinese have, as the oldest civilization, ongoing civilization today, the Chinese have a very powerful, for them, counter narrative to our values narrative, which we have to take very seriously. But for Canada, there always is the American relationship as well, and very important. So, for example, if you look at the book that Christian, Alexander, and I have been working on, it takes a look at the 4 battle groups in the 3 in the Baltics and 1 in Poland that NATO has set up in the wake of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Why are we there? Because it's important for us to protect small democracies. So we are in Latvia. And when I take my students to Latvia, we've done that 3 summers now, they get a very, very different view of the world. The Russians nearby, the concern among Latvians is very palpable. But we're also there because the American government really hoped, and the president himself even phoned his counterpart in Ottawa and persuaded us that it would be very helpful for us if we also would engage. So there's always that transatlantic link that connects to Washington and Ottawa. Needless to say, the last 4 years have been enormously difficult for Canada, because with the blatant lack of respect and interest in NATO at the highest White House level, not at the military level, we have been very uncertain what our great American friend and leaders are doing regardless in regard to this alliance. So we will see after the election, a few weeks from now. We would anticipate that if a clear Biden victory is established, hopefully quickly, that Canada would have an opportunity to work close again with Washington about which steps NATO needs to take next. And this brings me back to my earliest comment, which is I think Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific is something that the United States is going to raise with us. There's no way the Americans are going to tackle every problem in Asia vis-a-vis China alone and leave NATO happily do its thing there. It's going to ask for some convergence. I'll leave it at that.
We're talking about the NATO being the Western flank, or Canada being the Western flank of NATO a little bit, and seeing it from that point of view for sure. Dr. Luprecht, Dr. Lenochka, Dr. Greco, any thoughts on viewing Canadian foreign policy and how different events, certainly Dr. Mons mentioned the election of Donald Trump, of course, pushing us a little closer towards NATO being one of the prime battle flags of the Canadian foreign policy, if you will. Are there any other main points that have pushed us in this direction?
I mean, go ahead, Alexander.
I mean, the simple fact of the matter is that what happened in Ukraine in 2014 pushed us into this direction, right? So that's the efficient cause for why we are involved in Northeastern Europe as it is. If it weren't for the annexation of Crimea and the flagrant violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity in 2014 and ever since, Canada's posture in the world would be different. Certainly it would not be present in Latvia to this very day. So I think that is the signature event. And I think that signals that at the end of the day, NATO is a military alliance. So as much as all that's been said about principles and values is very important and very much relevant to this organization. Indeed, the language of the Washington Treaty suggests as much. This is still an alliance that is preoccupied with issues of military concern, and that military concern, at least for a part of the alliance, not for everyone within the alliance, has been Russia's behavior in Ukraine and ever since. So I have in mind cyber attacks against various legislative bodies in NATO capitals, incursions into NATO airspace, other forms of subversion, either against the Baltic countries themselves by way of supporting certain groups that might undermine the political order of those countries, to election interference in other parts of the alliance. Now, again, because it's a military alliance, threat perceptions obviously have a large role to play, because threats inform what sort of military equipment we buy, what sort of training activities we undertake, and so forth. And as much as human rights and issues pertaining to the economy, are matters of contentiousness within the alliance, I think in more recent years, it has been more about how to allocate resources to certain problems. So again, within Northeastern Europe, the threat, of course, is Russia. Within other parts of NATO, specifically the so-called southern flank, Italy, and so forth, the preoccupation has been migration and what sort of transnational threats could arise from certain migrant flows. And of course, countries like Italy are going to have very different opinions as to how to manage or address the issue relating to Russia. And there's quite a few cleavages within the alliance to that effect. So Canada is interesting because it's not in Europe, so it's not necessarily directly affected by developments in the southern flank or in the eastern flank, as it were. But nevertheless, for reasons that my colleagues have pointed out, it has a stake in the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of NATO countries, as well as their basic security vis-a-vis these outstanding threats. But because we're also an Arctic country, and we might see certain synergies between the Baltic space and the Arctic space, things like what happened in Ukraine do matter to us, because that could portend something in Northeastern Europe, which could then affect the balance of power up north. So you don't need to necessarily invoke a story, as some people have, that because of certain diaspora groups living in Canada, Canada is interested in events in Europe. I don't think that's necessary. And I think indeed such narratives are a bit overstated in terms of how much importance they accord to certain diaspora groups. I have, of course, in mind the Ukrainian one, but one could also just as well invoke Polish and other Baltic diaspora groups. Even the Prime Minister himself, in rationalizing or explaining the decision of Canada's to get involved in that battle group in Latvia, did invoke how Canada and Latvia have long-standing historical ties, which I think was a bit of a mistake, if I can be perfectly frank, because when most Canadians think of long-standing ties with another country, they don't necessarily think of Latvia, so it's a bit peripheral to their radar. Whereas I think for the other issues that have been laid out on the table, I think there you do see much more that is directly at stake for Canada and Canadian national security as such. So I think the efficient cause for why we're involved in NATO following the Wales and Warsaw summits has been, in fact, Ukraine. Because even before 2014, in the twilight years of the Harper government, I think there was actually some disillusionment with NATO in light of how certain countries are not doing their fair share in combat operations in Afghanistan, and so forth. So I think what had happened in Ukraine, what's been going on with Russia since 2014, have more or less light fire underneath us in order to get so involved.
Look, I'll offer, Robert, you opened the door to sort of some disagreement or some nuances, so maybe I'll offer a couple of those.
Oh,
and then,
no disagreement. Oh no.
And then Dr. Greco maybe wants to weigh in and see if she can mediate in the nuances that I will introduce here. But I think you made two very important points, I think, in the question that sort of set up this round of discussion. One is you talked about the rules-based international order. I think most politicians that talk about the rules-based international order, by and large, have no real idea of what they're talking about. It's this sort of amorphous, and the reason why I point this out is because the rules-based international order can be about the economy, about politics, or can ultimately be about human rights. And I think this is sometimes when people add the qualified liberal to that, then I think that means sort of a broader spectrum, but when they drop that qualifier, then they sometimes mean, I think, perhaps a narrower spectrum. And I think that's fundamentally important because it means depending on which politician you are in Ottawa that talks about the rules-based international order, you also have different conceptions of what the instruments of power are in terms of the Canadian Armed Forces and NATO. Is it simply a realist tool to defend particularly concrete military interests, or is it also a constructivist tool to advance a certain sort of perspective on the world? And the reason why I think this is so important, because you asked about the Canadian, the Canadian interests in this. And I think this is the fundamental disagreement when it comes to the Canadian Armed Forces, which of course are the key instrument that we have in terms of contributing to NATO in terms of actual capabilities. And if it was correct that NATO was merely a military alliance and the objectives were primarily defense objectives, we would presumably see a much higher and much more aggressive defense spending and investment in NATO than we have seen. And I think certainly if we go back to Trudeau père, so Pierre Elliott, and his decisions with regards to NATO and sort of what was then seen as sort of a downgrading of Canada's involvement in sort of its Cold War deployment in Europe, suggests that NATO is actually, from I think a political perspective, much more of a political alliance for political leverage than it is exclusively a military alliance. And I think that then explains why the folks in uniform and the folks up on the Hill fundamentally disagree about what to invest in, how much to invest in defense, and what to invest in defense. Because for the folks up on the Hill, this is sort of a cost-benefit calculation. And my colleague Joel Sokolsky and I have written a well-known article on this, defense policy Walmart style. You don't want to give a completely discount, but really what you want is sort of some brand name that ultimately sort of gets you what you want, but we're not going to spend on sort of the Cadillac version because the political value added is going to hit rapidly diminishing returns from a political perspective. Whereas I think, of course, the folks in uniform, they want to ultimately spend on kit and on capabilities, and they want to have a full spectrum military component in terms of our expeditionary our expeditionary capabilities. And that's, I think, where it's important to think about. So what utility does NATO serve, in particular when it comes to Europe? And so that comes down to the broader points that I made earlier about that Canada has a fundamental interest in the prosperity, harmony, unity, democracy, territorial integrity of Europe and European countries. But why? Because if we look at history, whoever ultimately controls Europe has also tended to control the politics in the world. So if you look at sort of until the US really got involved in Europe and aggressively involved in Europe, the US was a regional power. A hemispheric sort of South North American regional power, really sort of until it went all in World War II. And of course, that was a political decision and a political calculus in Washington. It wasn't just an accident that ultimately the US had global interests. It was going to invest itself at a global scale during and aftermath, sort of after having seen the challenges that US that the US sort of staying out of Europe brought us in terms of the economic calamities, the political calamities, the violence and atrocities of the Holocaust. And just, I think, a political decision that those were liabilities that the United States was no longer willing to live with, not just on a humanitarian scale, but also, I think, on a political scale, that this was not in America's interests to keep fighting these wars over Europe. And let's remember, from a Canadian perspective, how did we ultimately liberate Europe? It was Canada that was there in 1939 and that held down the fort in the United Kingdom, while the Americans were sitting on the fence trying to decide what they were going to do. And there's a case to be made that we might not have the Europe that we have today if Canada hadn't been there in 1939 from the outset, while the Americans were trying to figure out what their involvement was going to be. And so I think Canada looks at this and says, we fundamentally need to make sure that we have all hands on deck. And you can track this hypothesis empirically. Where is Canada deploying its assets, its capabilities when it comes to NATO? It's either primarily within the NATO territory itself or with missions that are distinctly NATO-type missions. In Iraq, for instance, where all NATO member countries were involved, but then, of course, Trump pushed for a full NATO-type mission, and Canada stepped up and took the leadership of the training mission in Iraq. So whether it is in terms of the northeastern flank, whether it's in the Mediterranean and some of the disasters that have come with that in terms of the recent helicopter crash that reminded Canadians that we also have an important presence on the southern flank, or whether it's sort of the out-of-area conflict management, counterterrorism missions in the Middle East in general, and in particular in Iraq. But of course, we have a presence in every country around Syria, with the exception of Syria itself, which demonstrates also a broader regional sort of commitment that shows that European stability isn't just defended within Europe's borders, it's also defended in the broader European neighborhood. And as the United States reallocate their assets, because ultimately it's a zero-sum game. Even the Americans only have so many assets. If their priorities in the Asia-Pacific theater, where 2/3 of US deployed assets are already located, then that means ultimately somebody's going to have to backfill within Europe and the broader sort of European neighborhood, if my hypothesis about sort of European sort of broader stability, prosperity sort of is correct. And the Americans are saying, you know, our priorities in the Asia-Pacific, and we understand that other countries might only be able to pony up so much when it comes to that area. And it's kind of the reverse of 1939, 1940, where other countries are trying to figure out what is their involvement in the Asia Pacific. And the Americans already have gone all in. But I think the calls from Washington, regardless of who's going to get elected, is going to be that countries like Canada and European countries need to do more simply because American priorities are shifting and are shifting quickly.
So,
correct.
So I don't think that NATO is strictly a military alliance. Obviously, it's a political alliance. The language of the charter reflects that. It's not the European Union. So I just want to, bring the military back in, so to speak. But even if NATO were strictly a military alliance, I would still expect wide variation in how countries allocate resources to their militaries. In fact, we have theories that predict that the larger the alliance, the more free riding there will be. Now, I don't necessarily believe in those theories. I think countries that are proximate to certain threats or security challenges will spend more on their defense, regardless of the size of the alliance. And I think this more or less explains why you see countries like those in the Baltic countries countries like Poland do spend more, precisely because they have a lot to lose if the United States or other partners do not show up if something were to happen on their border. Canada is very peculiar because Canada, I think, actually rationally free rides in the sense that Canada has a long border with the United States, and such that any missile that is headed our way looks like it's going to also hit, or might hit instead, the United States. So it has in many ways an involuntary commitment from the United States that other countries simply do not have, because they're separated from the United States by way of oceans, not by way of an imaginary line as what we have here in Canada. So Canada is able to get away with the spending levels that it has precisely because of this very unique circumstance that it alone has. So that places Canada in an interesting situation, because it has these incentives to free ride, and I think it does to some extent. But at the same time, since 2016, 2017, after the Warsaw Summit, Canada is putting itself out there, and it's has a large troop commitment to Latvia. And if I recall correctly, there are about 450 troops. That's actually a large contingent for any country, but that's certainly the largest for Canada. But the issue there is whether we actually have the capabilities to do the particular mission set that is required with respect to defense and deterrence in that space. I know firsthand from people who have served in that mission that maybe not recently, but certainly when that mission began, that they felt under-equipped or underappreciated, that they did not receive adequate attention, that certain capabilities had experienced major deficiencies, not least electronic warfare capabilities. These things do matter, and they matter because if something were to happen, and I think the likelihood of any sort of major assault on Baltic territory is highly improbable, you still want to present as credible of a combat force as possible, but that will be very tough to do if there's very little attention given to that mission, to say nothing of the resources invested within it. So, obviously NATO is a political alliance just as much as it's a military alliance, but the military component cannot be necessarily brushed aside either. I'm not saying anyone here is brushing that aside, but I think it's just worthy to remember that Canada is very lucky because of its geographical positioning and has been able to get away with certain things that other countries simply cannot. Canada puts itself out there in pursuit of a certain mission, and that mission is very noble and very important, but at the same time it does require certain investments, and I'm not sure if Canada is necessarily making those investments, even in 2020 after 4 years of Trump. But again, even if Trump remains in office, that involuntary security commitment still stands. That's the very privileged position in which Canada finds itself, and so I think we just need to be mindful of that.
Dr. Greco.
Yeah, and arguably that's kind of one of the arguments in favor of looking at contributions in a different way instead of just simply looking at the 2% expenditures.
Do you mind just explaining the 2% just a smidge more? I just want to make sure everybody who's watching understands.
Sure. So at the Wales Summit in 2014, NATO members agreed that they would spend or try to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And the goal was to achieve that by 2024. And of course, to bring the pandemic into the equation as well, as a result, that might seem a little bit less likely now. And to kind of circle back to the idea of whether NATO is a military alliance or what it is predominantly viewed as, absolutely yes. And I think that over time, we've mentioned different critical junctures, different events historically that have led to a retreat of looking at NATO as something of more of a collective security arrangement and focusing more on just the defense component. And so that's perhaps why Canada's role within the alliance has been undervalued. And also in the context of free riding, it doesn't also account for any of the other contributions that Canada is making to the alliance. And I think this kind of back and forth between needing to refocus on defense has led Canada to seem as though it's not contributing its fair share.
Great. I'd like to, I realize that we're at an hour now. So I just want to skip ahead to a few other questions that we have. We already mentioned a little bit through the discussions what kind of some of Canada's contributions are at the moment as far as our commitments in soldiers. We've got constant naval operations going on, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea. We do have our contingent in Latvia. We have a contingent in Iraq. Is this right-sized? Should we be doing more? Well, what else could Canada's commitment to NATO realistically look like in the next few years? Should we just kind of stay on as it is, or is there something more we could be doing that would be of greater advantage to either our power or our principles?
So I'll just offer a couple of short reflections on that, genuinely short compared to my other interventions. but I think makes a nice segue from what we just talked about. So that, look, I think, you know, again, it offers a nice nuance, I guess, between Alexander Lenoshka's perspectives and my own. But the case that we've made with Professor Sokolsky is that Canada isn't free riding. Look, Canada spends $22 billion a year. That's about 25%, give or take, of direct federal program spending, once you factor out all the transfers to the provinces and so forth. So it is the single biggest expense in Canada of direct federal spending, and defense in other federations I mean, the three big ticket items in any country are defense, health, and education. And so I think in that regard, you can track that, you know, at $22 billion, you're hardly free riding. The question is, how do you optimize? And so the case that we've made with Professor Sokolsky is that it's not a question of how much you're spending. Rather, it's the argument that Canada is spending just enough. The question is, how much is just enough? And is what we've been spending is it still enough in the current security environment that we live in, as well as in as Alexander rightly pointed out, the political environment that we live in terms of questions about and contentions about burden sharing. And I think this is ultimately where the controversy lies. And that becomes even more contentious in light of two separate issues. One is, look, I just had the opportunity to spend some time in Washington on a Fulbright chair. Every meeting that I went to where people sat there in uniform and where sort of another sort of Canadian would be present, there would be sort of some conversations about, look, it's about the 3 C's: cash, capabilities, commitments. And the Canadians would always say, don't worry about the cash, because we've got the capabilities and commitments, and we've just talked about those. And every time, guaranteed, an American in uniform would chime in and say, like, look, stop with your capabilities and commitments. It's time you actually put real money on the table in order to renew your infrastructure and to renew your military. And so I think there is a real sense that just enough also means that we have serious challenges in terms of renewal of equipment on a whole host of fronts, whether it's in the maritime space, the land space, the air domain, the aerospace domain, of course, NORAD renewal, the big question mark in strong, secure, engaged, that was not answered, and that could get really expensive, or it might not cost us anything at all. There's a big breadth sort of in there. And of course, the whole new capabilities and domain of cyber. And so there's a question of, you know, have we been spending just enough? And how do you in particular balance that at a time when, of course, fiscal constraint is as severe as it's ever been in light of the pandemic? And yet I think the demands globally, if you look at state and non-state hostile actors, plus changes such as the globalization of threats, whether that's the pandemic and the domestic operations and demands to which that has given rise, or climate change that is already affecting significantly many of the areas where Canada already has troops or has an active interest in troops and is sure not going to make life any easier. And you combine that with demographic change in those same areas. And there's a real, I think, argument to be made that what we've perceived as being just enough is simply no longer enough, both for our own interests and for the sake of the broader interests of the alliance.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, if I can just add some thoughts here. So I agree with my colleagues that Canadian military defense spending has essentially been just enough. By the way, if you look at what was spent on defense even during the Trudeau years as a percentage of GDP and what we're spending today, we're not spending enough to even replace what we have built in the late 70s, 80s. So just enough probably means just too little. And I fully share the experience that Christian mentioned. I have that as well in the US and everywhere. By that I mean great powers in other places saying, hey, how come you guys don't spend more? But the question is what for? And this is a realistic question in a democracy, in any state really, but especially in a democracy like ours. What for? And I see some enormously difficult choices. So one choice is, and this is a big temptation for governments in Ottawa, one choice is to change the subject to values that are not going to cost a lot of military dollars. Interesting forays into areas of policy that are more about diplomacy than about the military. I think that's a dangerous path. I think the military vehicle, the military instrument is actually going to increase in importance in the future, not decrease. And we must look at this very, very carefully. But what for? So, for example, should Canada spend more in NATO, do more in NATO on the eastern flank to protect the Europeans and NATO member states from Russia? I really don't think so. I think there is a growing rise that Europeans need to do that more so themselves. Should Canada spend more on the southern flank? In some ways, a very vulnerable flank in terms of refugee flows, instability. Well, even more so there is a sense that European Union initiatives need to step up. And while we should help, it'd be very strange for us to spend more than Europeans for a long period of time on the southern flank. Then, of course, there is the choice of North America, spending more on North America in the Arctic. Turns out the Arctic is another incredibly difficult place to do anything, very much like Asia-Pacific, but in different ways it is very expensive, very difficult, and in fact very difficult also because we in Canada do not really like to make the Arctic a NATO responsibility. We're worried about a complex relationship between America, us, and Russia. Well, we've got even more complex if we bring 29 or 28 other allies in. So then there is this feeling, what about Asia? You know, I agree with Christian that Europe has been very important in a historical sense, but maybe it will stop being the most important place in the world. Maybe it has already. Maybe it is, in fact, Asia that we need to think about. And so what would Canada do in Asia? And it's such an important question to ask. What would be the role of Canada, NATO in Asia, in Indo-Pacific? But it is nearly impossible to answer because it is full of difficult things. Many people will say, look, NATO has no business in Asia. Why would NATO have any business in Asia? We have a quad in Asia. We have the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. It's kind of like a beginning minimum alignment of some discussions. So it will be another completely different structure in Asia. I'm not so sure. I think there's actually going to be a lot more NATO kind of evolution that is relevant for Asia if NATO is to continue at all. So unless we can help our decision makers and our public to inform them what it is for that we need military spending, we're going to have just too little for the rest of our lives. And then it might be just too late.
So I'm nervous about NATO getting too involved in West Pacific affairs more generally. I mean, even within the European theater, there's so much disagreement as it is. There's disagreement as to whether to prioritize migrants or Russia. And so to introduce China as a new problem set for NATO simply will just add to those disagreements. And so I just don't really see NATO being effective as a unitary actor, to the extent that one can even call it a unitary actor, probably one should not, in the West Pacific. So I'm certainly worried that NATO will be sort of pulled into this direction to make itself relevant. I think ultimately Russia will continue to make NATO relevant. And I think there's been this tendency to look at certain economic or demographic indicators to say that Russia is on the decline, that over the long term, Russia will cease to pose problems. People have been making these arguments for the last 20 some years, and guess what? In 2020, Russia remains a problem. And if you look at some of the demographic indicators, you can argue that the problem is even worse for NATO members, at least those positioned on the eastern flank, than it is for Russia. So it's far from clear whether demography is a destiny for Russia, as many people have made this out to be. I think even U.S. decision makers like Esper, like Secretary of Defense Esper, has more or less pointed out demography as signifying that over the long term, Russia will cease being a problem. But I just don't think that's the case. I think, with the recent constitutional amendments that are poised to make Putin president for another 16 years at most, barring further amendments, and his life expectancy more generally, one can hazard that questions of Russia's fealty to various arms control agreements, recognition of agreed upon borders, to say nothing of what's still happening in Ukraine since 2014, whether all these issues will go away. And some allies might lose interest in Russia because they just don't perceive a threat, but I believe there'll still be a core set of allies who will remain interested in Russia, such that Russia will always be on its radar. Whereas China it's certainly becoming much more of an issue. The 5G debates in Europe are a testament to how China is becoming more of an issue of concern. But even there, we see certain countries go in different directions as to how to go about issues relating to Huawei. So Hungary, for instance, is very accepting of Huawei. Romania, to the contrary, is very much eager to do whatever the United States wants those countries to do. So, we see a split in Europe already on China issues. Those splits will probably only widen if China is able to use certain carrots and sticks. But even so, China does not or will not have power projection capabilities to pose a realistic territorial challenge to Europe. That territorial challenge can only really be meaningfully offered by Russia. And again, that's why ultimately NATO will still be largely concentrated on issues relating to the North Atlantic. And I think the West Pacific is a bit of a distraction. That's not to say that that NATO has no importance there whatsoever, but I think we just need to be much more modest as to what NATO can possibly bring to bear in that region. And besides, I see all these arguments about how European allies are rich enough to take care of themselves, vis-a-vis the security challenges that they face coming from Russia and so forth. Japan and South Korea are not poor countries either. And so the people who make those sorts of arguments about Europe can just as well apply those arguments to East Asia. So again, it's not entirely clear what exactly NATO can really bring to bear in that region, considering power projection and so forth.
Dr. Greco?
Yeah, and particularly when you're talking about NATO's expanded efforts in Asia, I think it circles back to the importance of values and norms and what role they have to play in the context of the alliance. And so I would perhaps push back on the idea that defense diplomacy isn't of utility, particularly given its importance in Canada's strong, secure, engaged defense policy. And a lot of the contributions that Canada has made that do have implications for operational effectiveness that may not actually be included in those defense and military spending budgets. So keeping those in mind as well, we could point to Canada's work with the Women, Peace and Security agenda that NATO has been advancing. So I think that that's something that's important to keep in mind as well.
All right, I'm just about to move over to some of our questions from the audience, but the last prepared one that I really wanted to bring on was to get your impressions on the US election, of course. A very fun and hot button issue. Whether it goes to Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, those are going to be very divergent realities that we have to deal with? What are some of those realities, and how do you think Canada might respond in either case? Very much an open question, but I'd like to see what you find most interesting.
If I may just make a few comments. The expectation is that a Biden victory will bring with it a significant American effort to rebuild alliance relations, including in Europe, with the Germans, but all over NATO. So that would be a good scenario for Canada, as I mentioned earlier, if the Americans take upon them again a positive and enabling leadership role in NATO, which have always have had. By the way, without such an enabling leadership, and share increasingly a hardening perception vis-a-vis China. So the American approach towards China may become smarter and more comprehensive, but it'll likely not end the rising rivalry between China and the United States. So I think it's important for us to think about Canada, defense and security, and NATO in the very long term. Think of it this way. If China's power continues to rise in all categories, and China becomes a true world power, which it's poised to become, and if America's relative power will actually decline somewhat, the most logical strategic option for the United States is to work with allies. And whether it's going to be renamed NATO, or whether from NATO something else flows that is global League of Democracies, let's say, that is going to be the arena where Canadians are going to have to think about what they want to do strategically, or where they fit strategically. And maybe this is something perhaps not appropriate for this forum, but maybe with the change in the configuration of power coming up, Canada will have to concentrate on creating more military power at home to become a genuine middle power with real middle power teeth and capability, in order for it to be both more useful for the United States and more respected by China.
Dr. Linochka?
I mean, so I think most forecasts have Biden winning. I think the more interesting questions are the Senate races. So anything is possible. There's of course uncertainty, and that uncertainty is real. But I think a Biden presidency is largely going to happen. Now, the Trump administration has already signaled what it's going to do in the second mandate, if it were to receive one, and that is to really fulfill the promise, so to speak, of the concept that it unveiled this past summer, where it envisioned the reduction of US forces in Germany, redeploying some of them to other parts of Europe, whether in the Black Sea Basin or to Italy or even to Belgium. Countries that actually spend even less on their military as a share of their gross domestic product. And indeed, I think what the concept truly signifies is not necessarily some sort of desire to placate the demands of the White House on the part of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, although there's certainly some element to that. But there is this longue durée tendency on the part of the United States to indeed withdraw forces from Europe to focus on East Asia, and in addition to that, lean more and more on rotational forces as opposed to permanently deployed forces located in theater. That's been more or less a process that we have seen the last 25 years. You can even think of the enhanced forward presence as being part and parcel of this particular process, because the EFP relies exclusively on units rotating throughout the region and those battle groups to officially abide by the terms of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which posits that there would be no permanent stationing of substantial combat forces east of Germany. So I think the Trump administration has more or less signaled that's what it's going to do. Now, whether the president will do something else, that's anyone's guess. But I think the Biden administration will more or less still act on certain parts of this concept. It might symbolically reject parts of this concept because it wants to signal that it's back on the world stage as a bona fide ally to partners in Europe and to East Asia. But some of these changes were changes that the DoD have been wanting to make for a while. And I think there's this tendency these days, well, ever since Trump was elected, really, to think that prior to 2016, alliance relations in Europe and in East Asia were more or less calm and halcyon. That's just not true. Abandonment fears were rife in East Asia and in parts of Europe, especially after Crimea. Maybe those fears have ratcheted up, certainly with the uncertainty surrounding the mood of the president and what sort of tweets he's going to send out. But the baseline level of uncertainty regarding US security guarantees has more or less been there, at least since 2008 with the financial crisis, such that we're still grappling with these issues. And Trump has somewhat diverted us from those baseline issues. And we never really had a serious conversation. Maybe now we are, because we're paying more attention to the rise of China and what that might mean for our engagement in Europe and so forth. But at the end of the day, I mean, these are trends that have been accumulating for a while, and we're only starting to talk about them very seriously. And maybe that's a reflection of strategic thought these days. But I think there are these long durée tendencies that will transcend any sort of administration moving forward.
Dr. Greco.
Either way, burden sharing commitments are going to be pushed to the forefront if Trump is reelected. There's the concern that the US will pull out of NATO. If it's a Biden win, then there's a concern that bigger requirements are going to be placed on NATO as well as Canada itself. So regardless, in the coming years, there's going to be an increase in demand on the alliance, and particularly on Canada, given its relationship to the US. And regardless of the situation, we're looking at a lot of threats to unity in terms of the way that the Trump administration has referred to NATO. In doing so, he has kind of eroded the importance of Article 2 and the idea of collective defense coming to an ally's aid. There are studies recently that are suggesting that public support for the alliance has also decreased. And now with the pandemic, I think there's going to have to be a lot more collaboration in terms of how we can, or how countries can work together in terms of figuring out how to deal with capacity building coordination, because there are a lot of active operations, and that is going to require a lot of consultation. And certainly the hope is not that states will unilaterally decide what they will be doing, and that there will be ample consultation among allies to determine how to move forward.
Go ahead, Dr.
So you might guess I'll have a bit of a slightly nuanced sort of perspective on this. So look, I mean, it's always been America first, right? So every country ultimately looks out for itself. And the reason I say it's always been America first is because it's always been about US unilateralism, right? So depending on what president we get, Obama is unilateralism with a smile, Trump is unilateralism with a frown, but it's ultimately really always about US unilateralism. And so I think the point that Dr. Greco makes, burden sharing. Look, the first burden sharing crisis, December 1953, John Foster Dulles, right? So it's like we've been at this for a long time. And I think in terms of sort of America first, that actually also gives us a bit of reassurance in terms of US unilateralism. Because if we look at the different theories of alliances to which Professor Lenochka has already alluded, so one benefit of an alliance to the superpower inherently is going to complain that, you know, others need to do more, it's doing too much and the others are doing too little. But one benefit to the superpower is that it gives it political leverage. You get a chance to control and to influence your partners within that alliance and that alliance structure, because you know that they have a vested interest in trying to keep the alliance together. And so that gives you leverage that you simply wouldn't have if you just pulled out of the alliance altogether. And my sense is that that's why sort of this discussion about the US just pulling out of NATO altogether is perhaps not as big a risk as people make it out to be, but the broader drawdown is. And so here's why this, I think, is an extremely challenging conversation. So we've already alluded, so there's the northeastern flank, there's the southern flank, there's ultimately sort of a global flank when it comes to cyber. There's a debate about whether there is a northern flank or not. I think nobody really wants to militarize the north, not even the Russians, because everybody knows that it would be hopeless to fight any sort of militarized conflict. But the western flank, of course, to which people have already alluded, that's highly contentious, because I think the Canadian and the US perspective is, look, we've come to Europe's help when it comes to the northeastern flank, the southern flank, even in the cyber domain. So what are the Europeans going to do for us if we think about the Asia-Pacific theater as the western flank? And that's a really, really hard problem, because the to collaborate, to coordinate our interests amongst ourselves, in part because everybody has this seat at the table and brings something to the table. And the more you bring to the table, the more influence you have. There is no NATO equivalent in the Asia Pacific. This was brought home to me when I had the privilege of spending the better part of a year in Australia. If you look at the Asia Pacific, institutional multilaterally, it's a really tough nut to crack, because there is no institution like NATO where you could actually get together and you could try to coordinate interests. And so that then suggests that the way you're going to have to get things done in terms of interests in the Asia-Pacific theater is through power projection. But of course, several NATO member countries have very limited capability on power projection, even those that we think of as sort of some of the more robust ones. If you think of France, for instance, France has for years now deployed a significant capacity of its military for domestic operations, both on the Plan Vigipirate, so its counterterrorism plan, and also within the context of the pandemic. Several other countries have drawn more or less extensively on their military in support of the pandemic. That limits their capability to get engaged in power projection, and the best country to test that hypothesis is France, because it's sort of still doing some things when it comes to Mali and the Mediterranean, but the domestic operations have significantly limited its ability to be active here. And so I think that could make a conversation about what role for NATO, if any, in the Asia-Pacific quite contentious, because it's going to stretch those countries, not just with regards to what do we need to do in terms of domestic operations, what do we need to do in terms of regional operations, but also what do we need to do in terms of global operations. And I think most countries are simply not set up for that type of debate in terms of their military structure. They can do one of those, they can maybe do two of those, but they simply can't manage to do all three of those. The US is really the only member country that can engage in all three of those types of operations. And so I think there's going to be some very hard and some very difficult conversations to be had. And my concern is that as the US sort of pushes that boundary, it's going to cause more dissension within the ranks within NATO about what exactly should be done. And as was pointed out, domestic interests are going to be really important here. And so I'll conclude those remarks on, there's a terrific article by Michael Beckley in the current edition of Foreign Affairs, arguably sort of the leading foreign affairs sort of journal in the United States. One of the points that he makes in this is that the United States might start, and I'm quoting here, the United States after this election might start acting less like the head of a grand coalition and more like a rogue superpower, an economic and military colossus lacking moral commitments, neither isolationist nor internationalist, but aggressive, heavily armed, and entirely out for itself. And I think given the way public interests in the US are going, the people that brought Trump to power, and of course that's a foreign policy strand that goes back to the 19th century, and it was just muted between 1940 and sort of the end of the Cold War, that sort of, those sort of demands are not going to go away. And so I think the more the US might gravitate towards Michael Beckley's conclusion, the less appealing and the more difficult it is going to get in terms of selling the importance of other NATO member countries supporting the United States and getting that buy-in from their domestic operations. And so I'm concerned that it's going to be a very difficult time forward, not just within the alliance, but also in terms of domestic conversations about what is the role of our military, what is the role of, and what is the role of the bilateral relations, and in particular the defense relations.
So Dr. Luprecht, that perfectly. Sorry, Sarah, you got something else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just a quick point just about kind of the tangible impact that rhetoric can have. If that is the case that Trump is reelected, and if it is the case that it's kind of simply rhetoric that he's saying he will pull out of the alliance, there are some tangible implications for those words, particularly as we see support for the alliance among allies and non-member states has also declined. So that will have a negative impact on any expansion efforts NATO may have, and it certainly erodes the legitimacy of the alliance itself, and makes, I think, a good point in favor of perhaps Canada taking on more of a stronger role as a middle power, and hopefully kind of some middle power multilateralism moving forward within the alliance.
Make no mistake, America First is not just a political slogan, it is a strategy.
So I think this will perfectly bridge to our next question, which is from Mark Fuster in Brussels at the moment. Hello, Mark. And this is regarding the reflection process, NATO 2030. So traditionally, of course, there is a strategic concept that has come out every 10 years. It's been since 2010. And now we have something that seems to be a little more robust. We have a Canadian, Greta Bausmeyer, who's involved. What might this look like? What do you see as Canada's main objectives within the reflection process? And how relevant is NATO in the minds of Canadians when we're talking about, okay, if we're thinking about 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, how key is that in the minds of Canadians? Thanks so much, Mark. So anybody would like to take that? Reflection process, I'm sure you've all had a good read about it. Any thoughts of where that may take us or may take NATO?
Well, the contentious issue is the strategic concept, right? And whether you open the strategic concept or you leave it where it is. And I'm one of the people who thinks that you want to let sleeping dogs lie, because if you open the strategic concept, especially with the administration that's currently in charge in Washington, this is going to be a dog's breakfast, and you really want to divide the alliance, then open that conversation. So I think the 2030 reflection notwithstanding, my sense is we're going to have to live with the strategic concept that we have, whether we like it or not, and we're going to have to make it work, because getting a consensus on a new one is going to be so driven by such derision, such contention, and such divisiveness that it would probably not be prudent.
Dr. Moens, you mentioned a little bit about the possibility of it morphing into some kind of an alliance of democracies. Has that entered your mind as far as the NATO reflection process is concerned, starting to step down that road at all?
I think it may actually not come up as prominently as we have discussed it this morning, simply because many European countries have not really gotten their minds around this and would by instinct not want this debate to go to NATO, but might want to try first if this should be done in the European Union. For example, Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, he has been talking with Secretary of State Pompeo about an EU-US strategic dialogue about China. It's not likely going to go very far. So I suspect this topic will be mentioned and some beautiful language will be agreed on. That doesn't say very much because the European members are not ready yet. And the Americans, of course, it waits to be seen for the next administration. But keep in mind, my comments are pretty long-term because the United States prefers to operate in Asia through a hub and spoke system, through bilateral relations. So the United States has had the option to try to bring allies together in Asia in a more NATO-like thing, and it has not been interested in that, seeing it has more power and influence in American-Japanese, American-South Korean, American-Australian relations. So my comments are predicated on a loss of relative power, which I foresee coming on the part of the United States, which makes the United States interested in these kinds of alliances simply because it needs that power. But to get there, from here to there, is enormously complex. So many questions. For example, would the Japanese and South Koreans be happy to sit around the table? There are many reasons why they are not so happy to do that. So in this particular thing that is happening in 2030, I don't see it as a big issue. What I find a little bit so far puzzling is that nobody in Canada knows what our position might be. What would Madame Bassemeyer be saying? Is there any idea what we want? Is it beyond, let's say, beyond feminist foreign policy, beyond other initiatives? Is there any grand strategy that Canada has? And I agree with Christian that it might be better to leave the alliance strategic concept alone, as long as you allow really concrete implementation of, for example, the NATO's 2019 military strategy. So the NATO military strategy, if it can move forward without changing the alliance strategic concept, fine, because it's on the military side that greater interoperability and greater pooling of resources is necessary.
Dr. Greco, I saw you nodding. You agree, okay. That kind of also does move on, unless Dr. Lanochka, would you like to?
I mean, I was just going to say that to pick up on what Professor Moens had just said, I think there's actually some convergence in the alliance structures that underpin European and East Asian security. So the traditional way of looking at the problem is that Europe is multilateral and East Asia is hub and spoke. But I think what we're starting to see is that there's greater compartmentalization in either of those regions, that there might be, in fact, pressure for more multilateralization in East Asia in light of rising China. Whereas in Europe, NATO will still exist because it will provide a sort of veneer of multilateralism and offer a sense of cohesion that might not otherwise exist. But like-minded partners in their own sub-regions are going to tackle their shared security challenges and develop niche capabilities as such. So you can imagine southern flank countries doing their own thing, whereas northeastern flank countries are doing their own thing. And you more or less see that with various regional formats or sub-regional formats that are starting to proliferate across that particular space. Whereas again, in East Asia, the rise of China is going to create certain tendencies towards more institutionalization and so forth. So neither region is going to look perfectly multilateral or hub and spoke. There's going to be some blending of the two. Now, what's interesting is how will Canada fit into that? And I simply don't have an answer to that question, right? Because I think as one of the audience members has pointed out, it doesn't seem entirely sustainable for Canada to be as invested in Europe as it has been over the course of the next generation. And I think Canadian society is changing also. It's moving away from having a more Atlanticist orientation, more towards a Pacific orientation. But if it's a hub and spoke or some like fusion of hub and spoke and multilateral, that could allow for some sort of entry point for Canada, but it would still be an uneven peg in a certain circle that could accommodate it. So I don't know, to be perfectly honest.
There's a big unknown out to 2030. And that is, what is the EU doing as an autarkic military actor here? And of course, this is the first EU administration where they've effectively stood up a quasi-EU type defense ministry. It has a director general. It has 80 military staff. We have initiatives that go along with this, including the permanent structured cooperation. And the big unknown for NATO and the big liability is the contention and the controversy within Europe about, should the EU become an autarkic military actor parallel to NATO, or should the EU become a more cohesive military actor as a way to shore up the synergies with NATO and in cooperation and collaboration with NATO? And I think, it's clear where Canada stands on this issue, that it wants an EU that's going to be harness synergies more effectively. It doesn't want an EU that becomes more autarkic on its own. This is the fundamental debate between France, that wants that type of actor, and much of the rest of European partners that don't. But I think in many ways, NATO, until we can answer those sorts of questions, that will have a major impact in terms of the reflection process out to 2030.
I was hoping to bring in a question from Paul Mayer at this point, talking about that division that we've been discussing between power and principle as two of the important concepts that are underpinning NATO and our actions. If political values, democracy, individual liberty, rule of law, are central to NATO, why are Turkey and Hungary still accepted as members? And I must say, from my point of view, as the president of the NATO Association, we get this question all the time, just all the time. What is going out? Kick Turkey out, all sorts of stuff like that. Dr. Moens, I see you have an answer ready.
Yeah, because I think I'm the one who raised this first. You know, in NATO, it's always been the vast majority, as well as the vast majority of member states with most of the military power, that have been liberal constitutional democracies. There's never been a perfection of all its membership. It started with Portugal still being a dictatorship, but because of the importance of the Azores, Portugal was brought in. It started, Greece and Turkey, of course, were brought in to both look after that problem from within, by the Americans being on the phone with Ankara and Athens, but also with the expectation and hope that in the wake of Turkish continued progress towards liberal democracy. That hasn't happened very much. Now there's great concerns about Hungary. Is it still a democracy? The European Union has trouble with Hungary on various scores. Poland is coming under the democratic gun. So my point simply is, look, NATO is an assembly of liberal democracies, but let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. It's never going to be all members all the time. It's if the dominant members and the dominant direction is no longer liberal democratic, then you have a problem. You know, but it's very different from the Security Council of the United Nations, where two of the permanent members are one authoritarian state and the other one a totalitarian state. That's a very different mix. So NATO remains at the value level a much more Canadian mix than the Security Council Permanent Five, for example.
The fact of the matter is that you rather have Turkey as an ally than not. It just occupies a strategic choke point. It's positioned, it's a bridge between Europe and the Middle East. And so NATO has had to put up with various misgivings that it's had with Turkey for a long time. In fact, conversations about Turkey's place within NATO have certainly pre-existed me. They've been going on for a long time. They ebb and flow. Sometimes we have this conversation, sometimes we do not. So I think Turkey's geopolitical importance sort of speaks for itself, and I think there is a reluctance to really go hard on Turkey for this very reason. Whether that emboldens Turkey to do things that we do not want it to do, that's another question. But certainly that is, I think, part of the explanation. As for Hungary, I mean, Hungary is interesting because even from the outset, Hungary was a problematic partner for NATO. That shortly after becoming a member in 1999, that there was a sense that it was not doing what it could have been doing in the Balkan space, that its commitment to liberal democracy was problematic. These are concerns that pre-existed Orban having a constitutional majority in 2010. Now, of course, Hungary is interesting also because it's not entirely integral to the NATO mission. It's not on the eastern flank as such, or even near the southern flank. It's kind of off to the side. And so, you know, it's more of a problem for the European Union in so many ways, but from NATO's planning, I think it can sort of live with it and maybe play the long game with the hope that maybe not in the next election, but in subsequent elections, things will turn around. It doesn't necessarily look that way right now in Hungary, but you know, I've been told by Hungarians that it's going to get worse before it gets better, and it seems to be more or less going that way. But you know, NATO has learned to live with non-democratic or problematically democratic countries ever since the very beginning, for the reasons that Professor Mons has pointed out. I don't think we should necessarily forget those historical experiences. These things tend to ebb and flow. Politics still happens, and so we can expect that. But I think it would be a mistake to necessarily jettison these countries for how they are today, because we might need them tomorrow, or they might even change tomorrow. These things can change rather quickly, especially with the pandemic, perhaps shaping or reshaping regional politics as it is.
Go ahead, Dr. Leprecht.
Just a very quick observation. There's another way of looking at this, which is in terms of civil-military relations. And democracies have a very particular concept of civil-military relations in terms of civilian control of the military. And I think if in any of those countries, civilian control of the military was genuinely to be called into question, I think that would raise serious concerns about their qualifications within in NATO membership. But I think this is a conversation about a disagreement on the political side of the institutions, but it is not a broad disagreement about the nature of civil-military relations, although we may conceivably, given the trajectory in some of those countries, find ourselves confronted with that conversation at perhaps a near rather than a more distant point in the future. And without in any way sounding like an apologist for Hungary, since Dr. Greco mentioned issues such as values, gender, and diversity within the armed forces. Of course, Hungary has a greater proportion, for instance, of women in its armed forces than any other NATO members, to the best of my knowledge and to the last numbers that I saw. And so while we might want to criticize countries on particular fronts, there are other fronts where than on other policy streams. And this is generally true with regards to much of Eastern Europe. And you can also see this within the German armed forces, where disproportionately the countries where women sign up as a greater proportion of the force, and where there is also less resistance within the armed forces and within the population to women serving in the armed forces, tend to be the countries on on the central and eastern flank, because they came out of a political culture. And let's remember, cultural change takes a long time. And so I think one of the things that we are living, certainly I think in Hungary and in Poland, is the realization that it takes much longer, I think, to get that political cultural change than the utopian sort of dreams and technicolor that we had, that you're going to kind of change countries from authoritarian systems into democracies overnight. And of course, those are also realizations that will be quite useful to deploy, so that we don't become as too optimistic in terms of our constructivist ideologies, in terms of taking other countries that have lived under profoundly non-democratic circumstances, and our hope in terms of the timeline with which we can bring about effective political, military, cultural, social change in those countries.
Go ahead, Dr. Greco.
I think everything kind of just speaks to the idea of multilateralism and alliances as kind of an ongoing project. And it's not necessarily to say that NATO is this all-inclusive tent, but it is inclusive to the extent that it has differences in political, social, and cultural views. And I think the hope is that there is a diffusion and a learning process whereby states are able to come together and learn from each other, whether it's benchmarking, sharing of best practices, and hopefully over time, those kind of shared core values will end up being diffused throughout the entire alliance. And I think that even speaks to, I think there was a question, someone had said no one had mentioned Africa. So in terms of some of the partnership initiatives that have been underway for some time within NATO, how those are also an illustration of those diffusion of values, notwithstanding different political or social situations.
Yeah, does everybody else mind? That was going to be my next question. I think it may be our last. Almost been here 2 hours, but did want to just try to bring out the experience in Libya. Clearly was a success from the actual strict what we were trying to do, or what NATO was trying to do from the campaign point of view, but the aftercare was an absolute disaster. What we are currently doing as far as the NATO mission in Iraq is supposed to be projecting security. What might the NATO involvement in Africa and the Middle East look in the future, and is the kind of teaching security best practices so that these countries can look after themselves? Is that the right tone, or I'd really like to hear some of the other opinions on the panel. Anyone?
Yeah, I'm a little bit on the cautious side of NATO and Africa, especially. I think we have seen some scaling back under the Trump administration of American deployments in Africa. We have seen scaling up of French, especially in Northwest Africa, against Islamist terrorism. But I haven't seen really much growth of NATO in Africa, other than some 10 years ago when NATO was helping the African Union on some capability building. I don't think there is enough agreement between the Europeans among themselves. The French are quite cautious about involving NATO, qua NATO in Africa. They're not really that interested, even though many NATO allies help, including Canada has been helping airlift questions for France. The European Union is still trying to work on that. So I see actually Africa perhaps as the least likely area where NATO will expand or enhance its work and presence, not because it is unneeded, but it's simply not united enough on what it would do there. So I'm cautious about that flank. So for the southern flank, I really think we are looking at the Mediterranean and the rim countries in North Africa. That's still a NATO and big NATO and EU issue. But further into Africa, I see less.
Look, I think there's Africa is fundamentally, I think, a challenging issue, in part because, of course, there's no military solutions to what are fundamentally political problems. And this sort of becomes apparent when we have issues such as the coup by Captain Sanogo, who, of course, had some of his professional military education at Fort Leavenworth. And so you see that best efforts notwithstanding, people do go off the rails. Now, NATO, of course, does have an involvement in Africa on a couple of fronts. One is the Defense Education Enhancement Program, so the NATO-D program, where, for instance, NATO is involved in countries such as Tunisia, Morocco, in terms of helping on capacity building, in particular military capacity building. And I think one of the great untold stories in Africa is the extent to which both NATO and by multilateral efforts with the EU, with the United States, have professionalized militaries, where the kind of turning the militaries from really the problem, at least into militaries that can make a more constructive contribution, because in many cases, they are the only institution that works, or it works sort of more effectively than many of the other institutions at hand. And so I think there has been inroads. The other issue, of course, one of the reasons why NATO, I think, will always have a stake in Africa, and Canada in particular, this is why this question is so pertinent, is because, let's be frank, nobody quite trusts the French on Africa, in particular on French Africa. And there is one NATO member country that brings real capacity when it comes to French, and that's, of course, Canada. And so Canada, I think, will continue to be asked to be present. We, of course, have a presence in terms of a mission in Niger. And I think you can put the countries into sort of a matrix. They're sort of, depending on the military and state capacity that they have and their willingness to work with other countries by or multilaterally. And so Niger is a great example of a country that has weak capacity but strong willingness to work by and multilaterally. And so I think, you can say the same, for instance, for Tunisia. So I think those are the sort of more targeted approach that NATO and NATO members, I think, are likely going to take to Africa. In terms of, I think it just doesn't make the sort of news that makes the evening news, but there is a long-standing vested engagement. The great challenge, I think, is deconflicting European priorities in terms of the European neighborhood policy, for instance, but also several EU missions, rule of law missions, policing missions, some military missions, both in the Mediterranean and in Africa, with often parallel but not particularly well coordinated NATO missions. And then you pile on top of that bilateral sort of efforts in terms of military capacity building. And I think it's a bit of a mess on the coordination side, where there's a lot more synergies to be had. But because of competing interests in Africa, it can often be quite difficult to actually find those synergies and to harness them.
Anybody else?
I mean, so there'll always be some degree of out of area operations that are in train. But I think in NATO, for the foreseeable future, there'll be a growing aversion to engaging in those activities, in part because they require different capabilities than those that are necessary for defense and deterrence. And a lot of countries, especially those on the eastern flank, found themselves having invested in capabilities that were useful for being in the desert, so to speak, like in Afghanistan, but far less useful for dealing with an adversary like Russia. That's not to say that it's entirely a zero sum. Estonia, for instance, is engaged in operations with the French and in the Sahel, but I think there's still going to be that desire to focus predominantly on deterrence and defense missions, at least for a certain segment of NATO countries. Now, Estonia may be doing what it is doing in order to curry favor with the French, because France is, after all, involved in the battle group stationed in Tapa. So there are political reasons involved, and helps also create further interoperability. But I think still countries that are facing a fairly acute threat are going to be devoting more and more resources towards those threats, because capabilities are not entirely fungible. You can't just transfer them from one domain to another so easily. In fact, even a country like Poland found itself in a tricky situation in 2014 when there were many observers who argued that it could not really mount a proper territorial defense. Even with the tank force that it had and so forth, it had just invested in different capabilities that were not fit for purpose anymore.
Any points?
Sure. So moving forward, I think that capacity building will also suffer as a result of the pandemic. So we've seen a lot of different operations either postponed or suspended, or having a drawn down number of personnel. So that's also something to keep in mind in those situations. As well, I mean, part of the reason why there was kind of an increase in the number of capacity building initiatives was because after the financial crisis, states were thinking we need to find alternative ways to tackle security threats that are outside of our domain. And their way for doing that was basically to focus on providing partners with the capabilities as opposed to using their own forces to do that. So that'll be an interesting thing to see how all of that plays out, and whether there will be more of an increased focus on collective defense, and whether these kind of capacity building initiatives will be scaled back as a result.
Thank you so much. Well, we have reached just about the end. I did want to give everybody the opportunity to have a parting comment, as it were. Perhaps it might be interesting for our audience to hear some of your impressions on NATO's current position. We have the Navalny situation and how that has impacted the eastern flank, not to mention Belarus itself. We also have the deconfliction that is going on between Greece and Turkey right at the moment. And then, of course, the Armenia versus Azerbaijan war, which is ongoing.
Yes, so crises come and go in Europe, as we continue to see. And the Belarus crisis, I think, is important to consider as the first post-Crimea crisis in that region. And I cannot help but notice the carefulness of all the EU and NATO members in their reaction. I sense that in Belarus, there is a great concern that if the NATO alliance or the European Union or individual members did too much, that it would cause an overreaction on the part of Russia. In the Greek-Turkish crisis, I see the absence of American leadership. This is not something the Americans would typically have let go this far. And this is an acute vulnerability if American leadership is lacking. Nagorno-Karabakh is a very, very complex problem that flares up every several decades. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly to which the Azeris themselves are actually driving it rather than Turkish support. It's not clear to me where that is. And also I found it interesting that Russia seemed to be a little bit slow in coming clearly out in support of Armenia. So too early for me to say more than that.
Any other final comments you'd like to make, just more generally?
I want to make this final comment, you know, enjoying very much this opportunity to discuss with colleagues and Robert yourself, NATO issues, and to bring again out for our audience, most of whom may well be from the West Coast, the continued importance of this alliance. And despite all the great challenges, problems that we have discussed today, this alliance will remain one of Canada's most important vehicles to work with in the future, and encourage students in Western Canada to think about this area of interest and study about it.
Dr. Lenochka, do you mind giving us a last word?
I think rumors of NATO's demise are greatly exaggerated, that if we look further back into history, a lot of these crises or shades of these crises have been seen before. In some cases, they've been even worse. Now, that's not to say we should be complacent or be smug in our contentedness, but I think it does mean that we can sort of step back and realize that we'll probably muddle through in some form or another, because that's exactly what NATO has been doing more or less since its inception.
Dr. Greco, please.
Just to piggyback off of that last remark, I agree that some of the crises that NATO has endured over its lifespan have certainly led to its strengthening. And so as a result, I think all of these situations that have arisen and will continue to arise will only reaffirm the importance of the alliance and Canada's contributions to it.
And Dr. Luprecht?
Yeah, I think we have some hard decisions before us. You know, if we look at this from a Canadian perspective, Dr. Lenochka made the point about sort of the territorial defense in Poland. The same, of course, can be said about Germany, where the US was very insistent in the 1990s that countries adopt sort of light armored brigades because that's where they felt sort of the future were. And of course, the problem is, for the US, you have a full spectrum capability, or sort of, because you just have the investment and the size. But of course, for most countries, they kind of have to make a strategic decisions of where they're going to put their investment. And the problem is you can't turn those investments on a dime, because there's significant sort of sunk costs associated with them in terms of kit and in terms of training or so. And so getting it right, what the future of the world looks like and what our particular contribution to that will be, as Canada renews its military and continues to ponder sort of its defense strategy in an environment where Canada and all NATO member countries will not just be asked to do more, but will have little choice but to do more, both on the expeditionary front as well as on the home front. I think that will be a significant challenge. And so I think I'll close on a proposition that I recently made in a paper that I authored with Peter Kaczorek for CIC, that I wonder whether, certainly in Canada, we might have some of the predispositions wrong. If you look at sort of the Canadian military is primarily postured for expeditionary combat. But there's really only 2 times since the end of World War II that we've engaged in expeditionary combat, Korea and Afghanistan. Whereas, of course, we've engaged in domestic operations and other sort of capacity operations much more regularly. And so I think there's perhaps an opportunity to rethink, if we want to sell our military to our populations and the importance of that investment, to turn this around and to make the case that what the military needs to be prepared for is sort of the homeland defense and the domestic operations, with the possibility to pivot to expeditionary operations. And I think one of the key questions is not just what we as defense strategists want to bring to this conversation, but how do we actually make that palatable to our domestic audiences, where every dollar spent, when politicians have a choice to sell this, we're going to spend it on defense, we're going to spend it on education, we're going to spend it on healthcare. Every time I can tell you where voters are going to put their check mark on that. And so trying to think about, can we reconfigure our own strategic concept and NATO's strategic concept to get both the expeditionary effects and the homeland sort of security and defense effects that we're looking for by fundamentally rethinking about the purpose of our militaries and how we situate that in front of our domestic audiences. I think that that endogenous piece will have a significant impact on the sustainability and durability of NATO and NATO missions going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a great discussion, very wide ranging. I'm sorry we couldn't get to quite all of the questions. There were quite a lot, but I think we touched on most of them, ranging as far afield as China and Africa, the Middle East, the Eastern flank, the Arctic. NATO covers a lot of ground, and as I say, it insinuates itself into everything. And if there's one thing we've proved, it's that you four have been an outstanding panel to be able to show us that wide-ranging impact that NATO has on Canadian foreign policy and Canada's involvement in the world. So thanks so much. And with that, on to Tatiana.
All right. CIC and I would like to thank all the panelists and Mr. Baines for their time and thoughtful discourse today. And thank you for everyone who turned in. If you had enjoyed this event, please sign up for a CIC membership and our newsletter by visiting thecic.org. CIC's next event will be partnered and co-hosted with UBC's Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, the first in a series of panels on the upcoming United States elections. Watch our social media this coming week for more details. And yeah, this event here was
like we got a
great.
Bit of a frozen screen there.
Oh,
A little bit freezing.
oh no.
Maybe I can jump.
Yeah, go for it.
You'll just have to repeat the last little bit. Your screen froze for us.
Okay. CIC's next event will be partnered and co-hosted with UBC Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, the first series of panels on the upcoming US elections. Keep an eye on our social media this coming week for more details. This panel right here has been wonderful. It's been great to broadcast to many Canadians and I think internationally in Brussels as well, the position of Canada and NATO. I know my first time hearing of NATO in the US was not until college in my 20s. To hear Canada is more than like a block of ice in the north, that they have policies and positions that really help NATO in a way. It's wonderful.
I want to thank Robert for doing a fantastic job, and Tatiana for doing a great job setting it up. Fantastic work. And I really enjoyed it and very much enjoyed meeting Sarah. Hope we'll have other opportunities. This was great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
All right, cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.